Hey folks, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. Once again, this is Alex Sacken, and in today's episode, we're continuing with our series on Francis Bacon. This is going to be part 4, and this follows directly off of the work we did in part 3, which was on Bacon's art of discovery, as he called it, which is basically his method for the philosophy of science, how to conduct science as an enterprise, and how to build the scientific method towards the articulation of what he called summary laws, which are sort of core principles that organize how nature moves energy within space. And so these laws become the fundamental basis of all other scientific knowledge that becomes specialized in any given field. It's all founded on a sort of root level of these summary laws. So the goal of science is to articulate these summary laws and then have them come back and inform the lesser, more specific disciplines of science. In this article and in this episode, we're going to be talking about an essay of Manly Hall's from the 1940s where he outlines 7 summary laws of nature, or 7 primary laws existing in nature that organize existence. So we're going to be discussing that article, but before we do, I want to go over, for the first half of this episode, go back over some of the basic principles in Bacon's philosophy of science, and I want to highlight these now outside of the context of Bacon's Great Instauration, which is what our previous article was based around. That the Great Instauration is Francis Bacon's 6-step method. So we discussed the philosophy of science in terms of that 6-step method in the previous episode. In this episode, we're going to be discussing some of those themes and ideas, but now just separated from that framework, and we're going to just try to highlight these ideas so we make sure that we don't miss them. And also, I think it's important to discuss them independent of Bacon's framework, just so we can understand how sort of intuitive some of the ideas are and how important they are to bring back into the body of modern science, which has sort of forgotten these principles. So that's the topic of today's episode. Hope you'll stick with it. It's a good one. Again, this is part 4 of an overall series on Francis Bacon. It's called The 7 Summary Laws of Nature. And this whole series on Francis Bacon is itself part of a larger book called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. And the table of contents for that are located on my website, alexsacken.com. And the written versions of these podcast episodes, the articles themselves, are available for free to read on my Substack, which is called thewisdomtradition.substack.com. So without further ado, I'd like to jump into this episode. I have a preface to begin this article, and then I have the first section coming right after that. It's going to be called Fundamental Concepts in the Philosophy of Science. And we're going to go one by one through a number of different key points that we first introduced in the previous episode. So anyway, without further ado, here's the preface, and then we'll jump right in. All right, so the preface, I'm going to begin. This article is the 4th in a multi-part series on the life and career of Francis Bacon, the great adept and master alchemist of 17th century England. In the previous article, we discussed at length Bacon's approach to the philosophy of science. As part of that discussion, we highlighted how the end goal of Bacon's 6-step scientific method, which he terms as art of discovery, was to distill and articulate a set of summary laws. These represent science's conclusions concerning the fundamental laws of nature, the ones that govern how nature organizes her creation at the most basic levels. In this article, I overview an important essay from Manly P. Hall from the 1940s titled 7 Great Laws That Rule the World, which offers his analysis of 7 core summary laws of nature, ones that have long been studied and appreciated by the esoteric tradition. It is worth pondering why these laws that Manly Hall discusses are not ones currently emphasized today by our scientific leaders. This is a topic I will discuss more in future articles, but for now I want to highlight an important but often overlooked point. In modern society, scientific activity is not exclusively conducted within the public sector, such as by university academics. On the contrary, the majority of scientific activity is likely performed in social spaces that are not public in nature. These may be in corporate settings, or for military use, or in private research. In each case, the findings of scientists may be kept proprietary, classified, or private. In other words, out of public awareness. In short, our public-facing academic intellectuals are not the only game in town in terms of the significant players pursuing scientific knowledge. Because of the non-transparent nature of much of today's scientific activity, it is hard to know if the science we are taught in school really represents the cutting edge of scientific ideas that mankind as a whole has discovered. Likely, when the full body of scientific knowledge is finally brought together, what we will find is that the 7 principles discussed in this article actually do represent 7 of the primary laws of nature, ones which have been confirmed and verified after meticulous scientific scrutiny. Before jumping into a discussion of these 7 laws, I want to first revisit a few of the underlying themes concerning the philosophy of science and the scientific method, ones that we first introduced and explored in the previous article, but which I would now like to expand on. That's the end of the preface. So let's jump into the first section. It's called Fundamental Concepts in the Philosophy of Science, and this is actually has multiple subparts to it, so this is going to be kind of a long section. So the first fundamental concept is that nature is the body of God. Bacon's approach to science is not secular or atheistic. Rather, its foundation is firmly rooted in God. Bacon's concept of God is rooted in the thinking of esoteric philosophy, which views God as being intimately involved in every aspect of his creation. As Manly Hall explains, quote, God is not apart from his cosmos, but is his cosmos. God is that universal life that is growing up in all that is. God is the Father of life, living in his sons, reborn through all that emerges from himself. He is space, and he is all that is evolving in space and through space. He is the form without and the energy within. He is the law and he is the lawmaker, and he is that which must obey the law. He is that which grows, and he is the world through which it grows. He is the cause of all things, their ultimate end, and their midmost state. In his own writings, Bacon emphasizes the notion that God designs and inhabits its creation through its own internal power of mind. For example, in his book Novum Organum, or the New Method, Bacon writes, quote, God is to be conceived as an eternally continuing power of thought, and as such, the only essence, substance, or matter, the last power and cause of all nature, a divine artist mind, eternally thinking, that is creating a universe. Being, in fact, no other than the order, operation, and mind of nature. By implication, in the thinking of Bacon, the act of studying nature is actually the process of discovering the mind of God working behind, within, and through nature. In Bacon's view, quote, truth is not distant, but present in all things awaiting discovery. It speaks through all forms and is released through every manifestation of existence. At every moment, nature reveals the presence of God. This is why, as Bacon tells us, quote, God never wrought miracles to convince atheism because his ordinary works convince it. Bacon continues, quote, it is true that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth man's mind about to religion. For while the mind of man looketh upon second causes scattered, it may sometimes rest in them and go no further. But when it beholds the chain of them, confederated and linked together, it must needs fly to providence and deity. To the philosopher, nature is man's greatest source of instruction. Its various kingdoms, life forms, energies, and forces reveal to the discerning observer the anatomy and will of God. In this way, nature exists as a great divine symbol of the invisible power from which it emerges. Nature is the body of God, and at every moment demonstrates the divine plan in action. By use of science, we can thoughtfully learn to read nature as a book of Holy Scripture. We can then leverage this knowledge to harness nature's energies in order to accomplish the great artistic work that, as humans, it is our destiny to one day complete. All right, so that was the end of the first principle. So the second concept or principle that we're going to be dealing with is the idea that science is the search for causes. Science is the search for causes. Bacon's art of discovery is grounded in the metaphysical philosophy of Plato. In particular, his notion that behind the material forms of nature exists a greater spiritual world comprised of spiritual powers and principles termed archetypes. Like Plato, Bacon viewed the greater spiritual world that surrounds the earth as a metaphysical one comprised of various intertwined powers, agencies, and life forms. Manly Hall summarizes this viewpoint. Quote, "This material world is a reflection of the invisible spiritual sphere, which is its source and substance. For this reason, everything that exists in the mundane nature is in some way a witness of the supermundane orders from which it is descended." That's classic Platonic thinking right there. Like Plato, Bacon thought of the metaphysical powers existing behind the material world as archetypes, which together comprise a superior spiritual realm of cause. The causative powers of the spirit world are concentrated and reflected down into matter to become material creation. Earth therefore exists as an inferior realm of material effects, which are generated out of immaterial causative dynamics taking place in a metaphysical dimension surrounding the globe. This Platonic view of how cause relates to effect informs at a fundamental level Bacon's approach to the philosophy of science. Specifically, it links Bacon's scientific method for studying the material body of nature with the philosophical consideration of metaphysics derived from the teachings of Plato. As Manly Hall explains, in Bacon's view, quote, "all visible effects are suspended from or supported by invisible causes. And metaphysics is that branch of learning which seeks to discover and understand the unseen causes at work behind visible nature." Here we discover that Bacon's approach to science is explicitly rooted in the quest to analyze both the physical and metaphysical planes of world existence. In Bacon's method, the scientist seeks to study the terrestrial world of visible effects in order that they may distill and articulate knowledge concerning the ongoing operations of the metaphysical dimension of primary causes which underpins our physical world. As the scientist moves more and more into a consideration of the metaphysical causes behind earthly affairs, their mind is gradually, as Manly Hall explains, led, quote, "from the consideration of forms and bodies to an understanding of the principles which animate these forms and bodies." Ultimately, becomes the scientist's purpose to discover the metaphysical form behind the phenomenon, the metaphysical pattern governing the physical complex. So again, science is the search for causes or the causative dynamics behind material effects. So that's a way that looks at the physical world as being a product of metaphysical dynamics. So this is again Platonic thinking. This idea of a metaphysical world of principles. These would be archetypes according to Plato's thinking. And so all material forms that emerge and evolve and live here on Earth do so as expression of these fundamental archetypes. So that's Platonic thinking right there. And so Bacon's method is rooted in that perspective. That's why he's associated with this lineage of thinking esoteric philosophy that goes back through Plato, through Pythagoras. So he's following in their footsteps. So the next concept we're going to be dealing with in the philosophy of science is that science must incorporate psychology and epistemology. Generally, when people think of science, they think of scientists conducting experiments in which they observe and analyze data points drawn from their physical environment. While this is typical in most scientific disciplines, in psychology, a new dimension opens itself up to scientific study, the internal world of lived experience. Of science's various separate disciplines, psychology occupies a unique position for the reason that the domain that it studies, the human mind, is epistemologically primary in relation to all other scientific disciplines. When scientists observe various systems in their external environment, an atom, an animal, a political system, a planetary system, etc., they're always performing this activity through a filter or lens, which is their own mental mechanism. This mental mechanism colors, influences, and biases everything the scientist perceives. For this reason, without scientific understanding of his own mind, the scientist cannot appreciate how much of his conclusions about things out there in his environment is based or biased due to endogenous mental factors taking place within himself. In the field of psychology, there are two main epistemological pathways that scientists may use in order to attain scientific knowledge about the human psyche. One is the way followed by most scientific disciplines, by designing experiments in order that subjects may be systematically observed with their behaviors and actions creating data points that the scientist can then analyze and test. This method is one that mirrors the experimental methodologies of most other scientific disciplines, where the scientist distances and barricades himself from the objects of his study. Psychology, uniquely among scientific disciplines, also opens the door for the use of a second alternative epistemological route or method. Here, the psychologist turns his attention inward on himself and begins to study and psychoanalyze his own qualitative experience of life. So this second path is the one followed by the pioneers of the field of depth psychology, Carl Jung and Stanislav Grof. And their method, which is also the method practiced by the old Indian yogis of prehistory, the psychologist turns his attention inward and begins to scientifically investigate himself and the workings of his own mind. At the same time, such a scientist may also work with patients to cross-compare his experience of mind with what they report. These clinically obtained reports of personal subjective experience become data points for a new type of scientific investigation, one that seeks to probe into the inner mysteries of human consciousness in a scientific manner. And I just want to note that I have a publication from fall 2021 called Psychology, the Science of the Soul, and with associated podcast content that goes over in depth more about this field of depth psychology. So see that material for more information. And more information is also on my website, alexsackin.com. Decades of research in the field of depth psychology has revealed numerous breakthrough theories and concepts. Perhaps the most notable of these is the finding that the human psyche exists across multiple dimensions of existence, with the level of the individual person being only one level, the lowest actually, that mental activity takes place in. Alongside each person's individual psyche exists a transpersonal collective dimension of the psyche, one that all people are connected to at all times. Carl Jung called this dimension the collective unconscious. The collective dimension of the human psyche is the actual foundation of human life. Each individual psyche exists always in relation to the whole, like a cell in a body. Being a part nested within the whole, each individual human psyche functions like an antenna, tapping into the mental energies of the transpersonal dimension and bringing them out into active manifestation within the body and personality. So, kind of leveraging this discussion, we're going to move into the next concept, which is that science is the search for the self. So researchers in depth psychology, like Carl Jung and Stanislav Grof, have discovered that concealed behind the individual psyche and collective unconscious exists a third factor, one representing the foundational presence within the psyche of a divine principle of self-consciousness. This principle is the divine self, the one consciousness or spirit whose life and energy is infused into every part of creation. Depth psychologists have discovered that the human psyche has the capacity to function at all three levels. First, it can orient itself into the body, which is the normal state of functioning for the human being during this stage in our evolution. Second, it can be oriented inward to cognize the archetypal realm of the collective unconscious and experience the mythic beings that exist therein. And third, it also has the capacity, or the mind, has the capacity to mystically transition into a cosmic experience of universal selfhood, in which the boundary of individuality is breached and the consciousness within the individual bursts outward to become the consciousness of the all. Experiences of psychological archetypes or universal selfhood are ones that generate within the person a special type of epistemological knowledge. This is knowledge that is esoteric in nature, meaning that it is inwardly derived. As the scientist begins investigating himself, and as he gradually moves his analysis deeper inward into the hidden realms of his own psyche, he discovers a new form of knowledge being generated within himself, a form that is epistemologically different from the normal outward-facing data-gathering programs utilized by other scientific disciplines. Describing the psychological basis of esoteric knowledge, Manly Hall writes that a special inwardly derived form of knowledge, quote, can arise from within the individual and manifest in the form of unalterable convictions that relate to the existence of God, the reality of good, and the immortality of the human soul. None of these convictions arise directly from experience, but may receive certain justification or proof from experience. Esoteric knowledge, such as that derived from inward mystical exploration, reveals in a direct, intuitive manner information about the root causes of things. In other words, by going inward, we redirect our consciousness from the perception of effects to that of causes. The basis of esoteric knowledge is the capacity of the mind to release itself from an attachment with the body so that it may explore greater metaphysical realms beyond. Manly Hall elaborates, quote, when certain areas of the brain are stimulated by the secret processes of the mysteries, the consciousness of man is extended and he is permitted to behold the immortals and enter into the presence of the superior gods. In other words, the archetypes, psychological archetypes. The mystical experience opens the door for the logical reasoning process of deduction to take place. Deduction is a form of reasoning that flows downward from knowledge of universals to knowledge of particulars. As Manly Hall explains, with deduction, we first, quote, posit a deity, and then, imagining ourselves to be that deity, construct a universe. This method is the counter opposite of that followed by scientists, who base their experimental methodology upon the use of induction. With induction, one starts with the cross comparison of individual data points before reasoning upward to articulate fundamental organizing principles and axioms, which are created to explain how and why certain relationship patterns exist within the dataset. Manly Hall explains induction as follows. First, we posit a minute atom, and then, through an infinite series of combinations and unfoldments, trace manifesting life back to its spiritual source. In short, induction describes a path of reasoning that moves from the part to the whole, while deduction begins with the whole before localizing itself down to consider a part. The field of esoteric philosophy is based around the accumulation of knowledge derived from internal mystical exploration. Meanwhile, the majority of science today, let's call it exoteric science, is based around the accumulation of knowledge derived from the study of the external world, or the physical environment. Exoteric science is conducted by means of the human senses and analyzes objects and forces existing in the external world of nature. Esoteric science, meanwhile, is conducted by means of ESP, or extrasensory perception, and analyzes psychological archetypes and metaphysical truths revealed from internal psychic exploration. The science of psychology kind of fits into the mold of Bacon's idea of human philosophy from his Pyramid of Pan that we discussed in the previous article. So the science of psychology occupies a middle ground between two other knowledge types. And this way, it's like a special form of science. So the base of that it draws on is natural philosophy, or the study of nature. And the apex of philosophy then transcends into what Bacon called divine philosophy, which in a sense is mysticism. So divine philosophy allows for deduction to take place. Natural philosophy is based on induction. And psychology is this medium of science that draws upon both. So divine philosophy unlocks deduction through its use of mysticism. Natural philosophy, meanwhile, is rooted in the use of induction, which is the normal method of science. Psychology, or human philosophy, exists as a special form of science that occupies a middle ground between the two, utilizing both epistemological methods. What Bacon and Jung have both taught us is that there can be no scientific understanding of nature without first a scientific investigation of ourselves. This explains the old philosophical adage that, quote, the proper study of man is man. The psychological study of ourselves leads inevitably to the realization of our own connection with a superior divine power, a power that is the simultaneous source of both life and the law that guides life. This divine power in psychological terms is called the self. In terms of cause-effect, the self is the first cause of world existence. Manly Hall explains that, quote, according to metaphysics, being is an eternal, unchanging principle and is denominated first cause. God is not a personality, but rather that divine life upon which all things subsist. And this one life manifests attributes which are also divine principles. These attributes are called the gods, but in psychological terms, they're called archetypes. Ultimately, in the study of psychology, or what Bacon calls human philosophy, we find a concept of creation fundamentally rooted in mental rather than physical dynamics. Deity meditates the world and all its various life forms into existence through a process that begins in the metaphysical dimension of mind and ends in the formation of a material world of physical bodies. The purpose of Bacon's art of discovery is to provide us with a method of true induction, by use of which we may study these physical bodies in order to ascend our minds back up the ladder of the intellect. By ascending this ladder, we reorient our consciousness from its focus on the senses to a new focus in the third eye, through use of which the deeper realm of causation, i.e. archetypes, is revealed. So once again, that principle is called science is the search for the self. And the next principle we'll be looking at is that science's chief objective is to describe and map nature's laws. So we're going to be considering this relationship between the self and nature. Helena Blavatsky states it succinctly. The foremost object of science is to discover and describe the laws of nature. The more research advances, the more laws they find. And they're beginning to see that there is nothing outside of what is determined by law. There is nothing that is not ruled by law. Manly Hall elaborates, quote, the universe is denominated by law. Law is absolute and unchangeable. All forms and manifestations are creations of law. Bacon's scientific method is grounded in this same reverential approach to divine law. In his approach, scientists study nature in order to master their understanding of nature's laws. The divine laws ordering creation can be witnessed in the world at every moment. Constantly, they invite scientists to seek them out and understand them. As Manly Hall explains, we are utterly dependent upon the existence of law. We depend upon this order for every institution of our existence. We depend upon a universal plan to give us the order of the seasons, to give us day and night, to bring forth the harvests. The scientist in his laboratory depends upon universal order for the accuracy of his experiments. Everywhere we accept instinctively the presence of plan and purpose. If we do not recognize within our own natures that there is a reason behind it all, our whole intellectual sphere collapses about us in chaos. We cannot gaze about us in the world and perceive throughout nature its order and its sequence without realizing that this universal plan bears absolute witness to a magnificent intellect. Stated simply, the universe is a planned purpose, not an accident. It is the manifestation of absolute law, and not merely a monument to coincidences. Because there is a purpose, a divine plan, quoting Hall again, we must search for its lessons, its implications, and its applications. We must orient ourselves and realize that we are part of an eternal progression, a motion in space, a motion orderly, progressive, inevitable, a motion in which there is no accident, a motion which is indeed the manifestation of immutable and unchangeable law. Once we perceive this law and realize that there is a purpose and plan for things, the things that happen to us assume their proper proportion. Incidents become meaningful. We are no longer victims of a blind despair or slaves of a universal despotism, but instruments of a universal purpose, a world fulfilling itself in us and through us. In sum, science exists to study and map nature's laws. This is the whole reason for the institution's existence. If ever science were to lose focus on this primary goal, if it were ever to become obsessed with perpetuating its own notions as an end in itself, even though those notions cease describing nature's laws accurately, then it would forfeit its right to accurately call itself science. Unfortunately, this is the state we find science in today, at least public academic science, the science we are taught in school. It has long since departed from a foundation in natural law and instead primarily seeks to justify the prevailing political and social order. In its own way, it has followed the ways of the Christian Church. Its leaders have departed from the way of the law and instead seek only to perpetuate and advance their own power and authority. This is a situation that is in desperate need of reformation for both religion and science. So that was the principle or the concept of scientists' objective being to describe and map nature's laws. The next section, or the next principle we'll be going back over, is the idea that natural law reveals itself through number and geometry. The inner workings of the divine mind reveal themselves through the orderly sequence of relationships established through number, mathematics, and geometry. The organizing principles of number, math, and geometry, and also music you could incorporate, are ever present in nature. Together they reveal the presence of a universal framework of law existing ubiquitously behind, within, and throughout all things. Pythagoras taught us that each number and geometric form in nature represents a divine power or principle working through nature. In its numerical investigations of nature, science attempts to reveal the existence of these divine principles. A close reading of the steps involved in the scientific method reveals science's fundamental dependency on number. The scientific method involves systematic observation of phenomena with observations recorded as scientific data. In some disciplines, the scientific processes of observation include controlled experimentation. In others, data is gathered directly from the uncontrolled environment. Next, scientists attempt to interconnect the data generated from their experiments in a coherent mathematical way. The resulting representation is a scientific model. The model is then tested by further observations and experiments. If contradictions develop, a new model is needed. Theories and models generated in one specialized field can be linked together with those of other adjacent fields to form larger-scale models or frameworks. These represent science's attempt at constructing greater and more comprehensive maps of nature's laws, with number serving as the foundation of the entire enterprise. As we look closer, we discover that the entire scientific method is premised on the idea that nature is inherently numerical. In formulating an experiment, the scientist designs a methodology where a qualitative statement in the form of a hypothesis is converted from a question or statement into a numerical equation against which the data gathered in the experiment is compared. Depending on whether the data matches the expected numerical results or not, the original hypothesis will be either accepted or rejected as being valid or invalid. In other words, the original qualitative statement will be evaluated as being either true or not true based on the numerical evidence that nature has provided to the scientist through their experiment. If a hypothesis is supported by experimental data, it doesn't automatically become an absolute fact. Rather, it lives on as a scientific theory, where it becomes the basis of future experiments, which will attempt to further test and refine it. The overall process is one of map making. By repeatedly submitting hypotheses and theories to nature, nature repeatedly gives us feedback about whether our initial ideas are on the right track or not. Using nature's feedback as an invaluable resource, it is the quest of the scientist to build ever better and more refined scientific theories and hypotheses. Therefore, scientific theories represent man's attempt to map the contours of natural law. Scientific theories, in turn, become aggregated into scientific frameworks, which are comprised of branching networks of theories linked together by larger organizing principles or axioms. As scientific knowledge expands up to the level of the framework, it extends out to map a more complete and encompassing picture of nature's overarching design scheme. This expansion in view brings the scientist closer to the comprehension of the one life and first cause. Manly Hall elaborates, quote, "The more we extend our intellectual energies toward the understanding of nature, the more our faith is strengthened. We discover first cause through the discovery of second causes. A faith founded in natural facts ascends to the contemplation of that universal spirit by which all natural facts are sustained." All right, so that was kind of touching on both this idea of science studying law, but then also using number to study law. And so science is really a project of map making, and you're trying to map the contours of law as it reveals itself in nature and in human life, and also in the motions of the heavens. So now I want to look at the next principle of the philosophy of science. It's that we learn in order to obey. And this is the last of the principles I'm going to get into before we jump into Manly Hall's framework. So the will of God is revealed through the laws of nature. On a philosophical level, this explains the purpose of science. We must learn the laws of nature in order to discover and obey God's will. By aligning our actions with law, we learn to behave in accordance with the divine will. Therefore, science leads to the same ends as religion, to live in accordance with God's will. Linking things back with Francis Bacon, Manly Hall informs us that, quote, Lord Bacon built his great scientific system upon one vast and all-embracing formula. The end of wisdom is that all men shall learn to obey. The end of his great instauration project is that, quote, men shall discover fact and shall abide by, respect, admire, venerate, and love that which is eternally true. It is only by living in accordance with truth does man save himself from the inevitable tragedies that result from living outside of it. In other words, it is only when we live according to law that we break the cycle of karma that traps us in this world of mortal suffering. The rule is simple. Man must suffer until he learns to obey. All learning is to justify complete and unquestioning obedience to the inevitable laws of the Creator. These are simultaneously the laws of nature. All institutions built contrary to nature's design must fall. So must all systems of philosophy or religion that teach contrary to the universal design. On this theme, Manly Hall points out that, quote, we can cling to our mistakes for a long time, but not forever. We can hold false opinions for 100 lives, but in the end, our own conceits become unendurable. In this way, Mother Nature reveals an incorruptible machinery by which mortals teach themselves by the process of trial and error. Through her evolutionary program, she gradually wears out the revolutionary instincts which obsess her creatures. When we obey nature's laws, we use her energies and resources in the way she intends them to be used. Here we make sense of Bacon's quote that, quote, nature is subdued only by submission. By this he means that man masters the world by obeying the laws governing the world. But, as Manly Hall tells us, perfect obedience or submission is impossible without first possessing knowledge of the laws to be obeyed. Therefore, the purpose of science is to render scientific the process of obedience. In another passage, Hall offers further elaboration. The ancient philosophers believed that no man could live intelligently who did not have a fundamental knowledge of nature and her laws. Before man can obey, he must understand, and the mysteries were devoted to instructing man concerning the operation of divine law in the terrestrial sphere. Hall then connects these views with the esoteric aims of alchemy. Quote, the alchemist was an artist who anticipated the needs of nature and obeyed. Man is also an alchemist. For anticipating the perfection that nature aspires for him, he can advance more rapidly towards it and in this way save himself a great deal of pain and sorrow. So that is really, all these come together to really tell us what the actual point is what the point is of science from a philosophical perspective. And how science actually links up with the aims of esoteric philosophy. And so Bacon really articulates this vision of science, which he calls the new method, or his art of discovery. So that is the end of the first section of this episode and article, and then the second one is really going to be just focused on these 7 summary laws and going one by one through each of those. All right, now let's jump into the meat of this article and episode. The 7 summary laws of nature according to Manly Hall. Having now outlined the essential points of Bacon's approach to the philosophy of science, let's now consider a classic essay of Manly P. Hall's titled The 7 Great Laws That Rule the World, which was originally published in the July and August 1942 issues of his periodical Horizon. In this long essay, Manly P. Hall offers us a comprehensive outline of 7 of nature's primary laws. In terms of Bacon's scientific methodology, these represent Manly Hall's attempt at specifying 7 conclusive axioms or summary laws, which are articulated at the 6th and final step of Bacon's art of discovery. These 7 laws therefore represent the crown jewel of Bacon's method. Together they serve as an ontological foundation upon which all further scientific knowledge can be built. Without further delay, let's investigate each of these 7 summary laws presented in Manly Hall's framework. The first one is the law of analogy. Manly Hall explains that this first law, the law of analogy, quote, is the law that is the key to the other laws. This is what the ancient Hermeticists called the axiom of axioms. In the ancient system, analogy was the key to all other realizations. It bound all things together in recognition not only to the existence of a plan, but of the possibility of the discovery of that plan by the human intellect. The law of analogy states that two different objects or forms are comparable because they equally relate to a third. This third establishes the archetype or root pattern, one that the two objects being compared both share in common. Because they homogeneously share certain principles in common, this makes it possible to differentiate between them certain elements that are heterogeneous or not shared in common. In other words, heterogeneity can only be distinguished once homogeneity has first been established. There is no such thing as absolute differentiation. All things share in the life of a common spirit, and therefore all things are capable of comparison. Relating to this law of analogy, there is a famous saying in Hermetic philosophy, as above, so below. This references the idea that two dissimilar spheres or dimensions of reality, one above, the other below, both share certain elements secretly in common. These shared elements convert the two dissimilar spheres into analogs of one another. One sphere, the greater, is in some ways different, but also in other ways the same as a separate sphere, the lesser. In other words, the macrocosm is separated from the microcosm, but both operate according to a common set of laws. In astronomical terms, we might think of the solar system as the macrocosm and the Earth ecosystem as the microcosm. Or we could think of the Earth ecosystem as a macrocosm, while viewing the human psyche and the material civilization it has produced as its corresponding microcosm. Further, we could look at the collective human species as a macrocosm and the life of each individual human as a microcosm held within it. So the pattern is consistent here. Two different things, but also in some way similar because they're both based on a common archetypal pattern of law. Manly Hall explains that the basic tenets of this doctrine are that all things are similar in principle and identical in pattern, but differ from each other in magnitude, which is size, and multitude, which is the number of parts involved in their constitution. Through the law of analogy, we discover that each of the parts is like the whole. Each of the forms of life that we perceive are parts of one great pattern. Each is built upon the same plan. Each reveals the same laws to its own being. Each bears witness to the same eternal principles. As such, quote, though forms may differ in their appearances, in their energies they are alike. And not only are they alike, but as small fragmentary mirrors, they all bear witness to one universal plan. That's from Manly Hall. And there is one modern scientific field whose work is particularly closely associated with this law of analogy, and that is system science. System science is an innately interdisciplinary field that attempts to map out the fundamental organizing dynamics of life on Earth. In particular, scientists in this field attempt to model the way that nature structures and organizes the movement of energy within her various forms and kingdoms of life. A system is a unit of life created by the self-sustaining circulation of energy. It is characterized by energy moving within a holistic structure, meaning a form possessing the attribute of wholeness. Each system is a whole comprised of parts, which interrelate with one another in such a manner that, out of their interaction, the overall unity of the system's internal design is continuously reproduced. This field is interdisciplinary because its scientists have discovered that one common pattern of energy organization can be found at all levels and in all kingdoms of life. We find atoms structured as systems, but also planets, animals, humans, social systems, ecosystems, planetary systems, solar systems, etc. Everywhere they look, scientists find systems within systems up to the level of the universe itself. As is clearly indicated, the findings of this scientific field affirm the old Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. A greater system can be compared with a lesser system because both are commonly patterned after the same design template, the system archetype. Thus, the solar system is like the atomic system. Both are systems, one above, the other below. So that's the law of analogy. The second law is the law of evolution. Evolution, in its philosophical and esoteric interpretation, means the expansion of all natures from within themselves through the processes of growth. Evolution is the law which demands that all things that live must grow, and this growth is a revelation through form of the principles within that form. It represents an unfolding from within outwardly of the potentials which are resident within. Evolution is the spirit growing up in matter, wisdom growing up through ignorance. It is space coming of age through form, the eternal expansion of that which is eternally moving toward the fullness of itself. That's all from Manly Hall. With evolution comes the inevitable refinement of forms. We may say that evolution is the refining of organisms so that the principles behind these organisms may have ever fuller manifestation and expression. But while it is involved with the refinement of forms, evolution is not merely a sequential motion from form to form, nor is it merely conformity to the requirements for survival. Instead, evolution is really about the spontaneous outburst of life. Through evolution, consciousness is released through all its forms. This eternal growing is in reality the release of one life through its innumerable manifestations. The purpose of philosophy is to cooperate with evolution, to learn its laws, anticipate its direction, and quicken the pace of its attainment. As Manly Hall explains, quote, man grows most rapidly when he consciously and purposefully cooperates with the plan of growth. This is achieved through philosophy. At the same time, it is only through growth that man overcomes the problems that plague him. There is no release from pain, limitation, or insufficiency except through growth. The alchemical aims of philosophy are about, quote, cooperation with the natural order. It is man choosing to grow. It is man throwing his every resource into the great purpose of his own perfection. Simply put, evolution teaches us to cooperate with our own growth. Manly Hall declares that this is our destiny as humans, to self-consciously fulfill our own evolution and thus to drive our own growth. Quote, recognizing our destiny, it is our duty to fulfill that destiny, to release through ourselves all knowledge and all wisdom. This was the purpose of the old mystery schools and their degrees of initiation. Nature's laws are slowly but inevitably driving mankind toward its evolutionary growth. This it accomplishes by presenting man with an unfolding series of stimulations, obstacles, pressures, challenges, and opportunities. While nature is continuously nudging and sometimes dragging mankind toward the achievement of this growth, the full attainment of man's evolutionary development will not be fulfilled without the human race self-consciously and self-willingly raising itself up to accomplish it. The mystery schools exist to meet this need. It is their task to initiate mankind, which is just another way of saying, quote, to self-consciously evolve mankind toward the predestined end state that the divine intelligence behind nature already has in mind for it. So that's all initiation really is it's a participation in nature's natural evolutionary processes. It's just self-consciously evolving the person instead of passively allowing nature to evolve the person, for the person to remain in ignorance about this process. So as soon as the person becomes aware and chooses to participate in this evolutionary process, then that is what philosophy is for, and that's what initiation is all about. And that's what the mystery schools really represented. The next law is the law of cause and effect, or karma. According to Manly Hall, the law of cause and effect declares that there is an intimate relationship between every action and its inevitable reaction, that nothing can occur in the form of action which is without appropriate consequence. In short, every action in the universe must be followed by an appropriate reaction. This is cause and effect. When applied to the moral lives of human beings, it is called karma. Hall explains that the law of cause and effect is the basis of our concept and understanding of universal justice. The idea here is that man's own action is eternally rewarding him or punishing him according to his own merit. The gold standard against which man's actions are judged is natural law. Actions that are in accordance with law generate no karma. Only behaviors that go against the dictates of law are ones that create negative consequence. Law requires no action of itself in order to exert its punishment. As Manly Hall explains, quote, law never fights back. The punishment for deviating from law is a consequence set up in the consciousness of the individual of his guilt of the act. In this way, law neither rewards nor punishes. It simply remains what it is and has always been, an inflexible principle. This way of measuring justice establishes for the philosopher a simple and natural program of ethics based on the premise that we suffer because we break the law. As Hall explains, quote, man striking against a pattern of law rewards and punishes himself according to his conformity or failure to conform. That pattern goes on unmindful of anything that lives. But man searching for happiness discovers that he can attain it only when he finds the pattern and obeys it. By implication, quote, the individual has in his own keeping his own destiny. Furthermore, everything that happens to an individual is an aspect of universal justice. Every man is in the place he has earned for himself. Every man is doing the thing he has earned the right to do. No one is suffering for the mistakes of others, but for their own mistakes. The only way to be happy, therefore, is to live well, thus setting in action constructive cycles of cause and effect. Hall observes that this is the law, quote, which most of us can most easily comprehend and most gallantly ignore. This is because the majority of us are still obsessed with expressing our own self-will and have not yet learned respect and humility to the greater divine will. For this reason, the root of our disobedience is self-will. The consequence for undisciplined self-will is negative karma or consequence. Not wanting to face the fact that our own suffering comes as the consequence of our own actions, mankind has traditionally sought out religious doctrines offering him a karmic bailout, so to speak. Hall elaborates, quote, we are eternally desirous of improvement without effort, and this is an illusion from which we must recover. This is a fallacy that has paralyzed the ages and has kept back the growth of man generation after generation. It has long been the temporal practice of religion to encourage men to accept doctrines of escape mechanism. Most religions teach men that they should be good, and then at the same time teach them that they can be happy otherwise. Such contradiction is philosophically unsound and has given rise to the crises we have today. It has given us a type of religious philosophy which permits the individual to break law with a good hope. Hall concludes that these beliefs are philosophically unsound because all wisdom knows that man can only achieve salvation by obeying the law. So that, again, was the principle of law of cause and effect. The law of reincarnation is the next one. As Manly Hall explains in his article, the law of reincarnation declares that the life of man is not the one small experience that we know, but a larger life of which these existences are but days and divisions. Man thus has one life, lived through innumerable lives, one continuity of purpose manifested through an infinite of fragmentary actions. Hall further states that, quote, the soul is a compound of experience and karma. Some things have been mastered, much more remains to be accomplished. By means of the law of reincarnation, the soul is drawn irresistibly back to the sphere of its unfinished labors. In total, the human soul requires many lifetimes to develop all its powers and potentials and to bring them into active expression. In the course of evolution, we must learn to do all things well, as Manly Hall teaches us. And in order to do all things well, it is obvious that we must live many lives. In his book, Questions and Answers, Hall provides further elaboration on this important law. Quote, according to Plato, the human soul is drawn back into the world by the worldliness within itself. That is, the soul, having accepted the reality of material things, is moved by its own conviction back into the sphere of its belief. As worldliness dies within the consciousness of the mystic, the gravitational pull of matter lessens until at last, released from the illusions of the material state, the soul ascends from body back to union with the blessed gods. This is describing that afterlife state. The law that pulls the spiritual entity back to physical life is karma. All causes that have been set up in the physical world must be finished or worked out by physical experience. Man, bound to the generating plane by sense, emotion, feeling, desire, and appetite, must conquer these impulses and instincts before the cycle of rebirth can end. In the search for experience, the human spirit returns to the physical world many times, there to work out its karma and perfect itself in the consciousness of the life wave. Thus, man lives on this earth not once but many times, returning until he has perfected himself in every lesson that this world has to teach. In the same work, he also, Manly Hall, discusses the inner mechanisms involved in the reincarnation process. The living human being is a compound creature consisting of superphysical principles manifesting through a physical body composed of the elements of so-called physical nature. By means of the nerve centers and the ductless gland system, the spiritual man controls and directs the physical body, giving it the appearance of life. The superphysical principles constitute the real living person, and the body is merely a vehicle by means of which the superphysical man can manifest in this physical world. At death, there is the separation of the higher and lower principles in man. Gradually, the inner mental principles of the person consolidate back into the higher spiritual principle, the higher self. In the process, the higher self assimilates the experiences gained by physical living. In this way, the period between incarnations is the period of assimilation, during which the entity builds the experiences of life into the soul nature to become internal strength. During this assimilation process, the soul experiences an afterlife state. The punishments and rewards of the afterlife are measured by the accomplishments of the individual while in the physical body. After the lower self has been fully assimilated into the higher self, the entity loses its personality and becomes again a pure spiritual principle. From this time, the memory of the past life exists only subjectively, and the continuity of consciousness is broken. The personality ends as such. The period is followed immediately by preparations within the ego itself for rebirth, when it causes a new personality to emerge out of its own potential creative power. Hall emphasizes that we do not incarnate against our will. Each soul, quote, having received a perspective which comes from the life cycle, will choose to return again to complete things which he has begun. We all leave unfinished business behind us. This mode of thinking reveals to us the mechanics of our own salvation. The individual who is releasing power through themselves is releasing God through what he does. Our talents and abilities are the attributes of a divine nature coming into power and manifesting through the development of our own lives. When combined with the idea of karma, the law of reincarnation justifies an ideal doctrine of ethics, one that can be fairly and equally applied to all. This doctrine insists that behind the inequalities and atrocities of our world exists a supreme principle of cosmic justice. As Hall explains, human beings come into this world unequally placed, socially, racially, and physically. We realize that the rich and the poor and the great and the small must be part of some large justice, or there is no justice. He continues, if we function upon the theory of one lifetime, then justice is not apparent. But if we expand our analysis to incorporate the concepts of reincarnation and karma, then justice may quickly be restored. The human race as a whole incarnates and reincarnates until it achieves perfection. This is accomplished through the sum of its individual members incarnating and reincarnating until each achieves its perfection on its own, or on their own. We therefore carry the cross, meaning we suffer for the growth of a greater life working within and through us. Hall concludes that, quote, by this very doctrine we gain the courage and incentive to better action. What more noble motive to virtue can there be than the realization that we will live tomorrow the substance of the deeds we perform today? If we look about us in the world, we can see through this law the working out of our own destinies. We are born the substance of what we have been. We come to finish the things we were doing. We come to take up all tasks and all purposes and carry them on a little nearer to the great end which we are seeking through eternity. That's from Manly Hall. And so is this next one. If from reincarnation we realize that we have all lived hundreds of times, and we will live hundreds of times again, that we all have died on the field of battle, we have all slain and been slain, we have all learned the lessons of war, and we have all learned the lessons of peace. We have all gathered in council together, and we have all opposed each other with strategy and tyranny. We have labored side by side in the fields and worked together in the shops. We have vanished in earthquakes and been swallowed up by plagues. We have been the life of the world since the beginning, and we will be the life of the world until the end. If we realize these things, then from this we will also realize that in spite of all our living and dying, we have actually never died. Death is an interlude. Life is an interlude. But experience is achieved through both and is in itself eternal. That was the law of reincarnation. The next one is called the law of alternation, or the law of polarity. Manly Hall points out that the law of polarity is one that is intrinsic to matter and form. It states that in all things there is a polarization, higher and lower, inner and outer, spiritual and material. Energy moves within the form in relation to these opposing poles. As it does so, it alternates between them back and forth, oscillating through them like a great pendulum. As Manly Hall poetically puts it, quote, everywhere, like the ebbing and flowing of the seas, like the inhaling and exhaling of breath, there is alternation of motion in space. Polarity is the basis of all differentiation in the universe. The greatest and most fundamental division is the imaginary interval between God and man, as Manly Hall writes. Another is the interval between man and man. Always it seems that I am separate from the rest, and my separateness is actually my own undoing. On the level of physics, the law of alternation manifests as vibration, which is the means by which energy sustains itself as an isolated form. The universe is comprised of a symphony of vibratory rates. Thought, emotion, music, and color are all vibrations. The esoteric sciences teach that by discipline and effort, man can raise the vibration of himself and the cells of his own body. Hall explains that polarity sets the stage for synthesis, which occurs at the equilibrium point between two opposites. He states that halfway between extremes is the middle path, the road that leads away from polarity and towards equilibrium. For this reason, equilibrium is nature's means to transcend her own law of alternation. It is the solution to the problem of division. Consequently, in fulfillment of nature's plan, all opposites are in eternal and incessant motion toward equilibrium. So that is the law of alternation. All things are polarized and then seek equilibrium between that polarity. All right, the next law is sexual generation. So this is basically the law of polarity or alternation applied to the task of physical generation. This law is based on the premise that universal consciousness is at its root a unified androgynous power that is polarized between two fundamental principles, yin and yang, or feminine and masculine. Within this context, sexual polarity exists as one of the manifestations of reincarnation and karma, and is part of the working out of the law of cause and effect in the sphere of mundane life. It's from Manly Hall. Also from him, as one ancient philosopher said, all beings are identical in their spiritual estate and divided from each other and within each other in their corporeal state only. This division is necessary for the sake of life experience. Through the experience of polarities, all life is evolving into the realization of essential unities. This realization is consummated in the attainment of equilibrium, in which the two polarities act as one. Sexual division is necessary for the reproduction of material forms. As Hall informs us, quote, the reproduction of any kind of form, emotion, or thought must arise from the union of two polar opposites. He then elaborates on the underlying dynamic that takes place. Quote, all creatures contain within themselves the androgynous attributes of the principles from which they are suspended. As they incarnate into matter, their androgynous identity is polarized into opposing sexual orientations. These opposing poles are then reunited in the act of physical reproduction or generation. In this way, material creatures manifest corporeally with one part of their spiritual consciousness subordinated or left in abeyance. Archetypally, the masculine part expresses itself through the body, and the feminine part remains unembodied in the spiritual world beyond. Within the context of the incarnating soul, its dominant polarity can express itself through either a masculine or feminine gender, leading to a male or female entity. As we know, at our modern stage of evolution, these gender dynamics can interface in complex ways with various psychological dynamics, producing the variety of sexual identities we see being expressed today. Ultimately, sexual differentiation is a psychological phenomenon. As Hall explains, the marriage of the sexes is, on a psychological level, the basis of the human emotion of affection, which is not basically a desire of one person for another, but a desire for equilibrium within consciousness, an equilibrium which finds its symbolic fulfillment in association. Hall also notes that the sexual polarization of a life form alternates between rebirths. In the doctrine of reincarnation, there is an approximate alternation of sexual polarities with rebirth, he writes. Thus, the human being, in the course of evolution, experiences growth in the body of both sexes, gradually building to the time when he can produce the asexual personality himself. In terms of the inner structure of the psyche, the sexual polarity principle is revealed through the opposition of intelligence and impulse, or thought and emotion. These are constantly oscillating thought and emotion, eternally confronting us with the courses of choice and the divisions of possibility. They are constantly showing us extremes and tempting us to bind them together. As the law of alternation previously suggested, sexual polarity gradually moves toward equilibrium. In practical terms, this means men taking greater interest in music, art, and culture, and women taking greater interest in business, economics, industry, and all of the practical concerns of life. That's from Manly Hall. Overall, when we are confronted by two opposing opinions, the ignorant solution is to say that is right and that is wrong. Two relative wrongs oppose each other, each with some measure of merit, but the truth resides at the middle equilibrium point between the two, bringing each into balance. In sum, the law of sexual polarity is a principle operating in nature that exists to force upon us the recognition of equilibrium and the inevitable necessity of concord. The philosopher king is he who weds the two soul polarities within themselves together and brings them both into expression. The collective achievement of this feat is part of the great racial evolution that lies off in the distance, but toward which we are inevitably working, as Manly Hall tells us. Manly Hall further elaborates, quote, as the human race evolves in the future, the sympathetic nervous gangliated system of the body will increase until its structure equals in intensity and power the cerebrospinal nervous system. Man will then have two complete nervous systems, and these, with their complete structure of ganglia and plexus, will permit the full manifestation of both sexual polarities in the same organism. Through this means, humanity as a complete androgynous being will be born into physical incarnation. This remains the task of the next root race, the sixth, to accomplish. And today we're said to be the fifth, so that's for the future. So that's overall discussion of the law of sexual generation. And then finally, the seventh law is the law of harmony and rhythm. The final law in Hall's framework of summary laws is the law of harmony and rhythm. This law is rooted in the idea that there are core vibratory patterns shared in common between all of nature's various planes of life. These shared patterns allow the possibility for life at all scales to resonate together in a great cosmic rhythm and harmony. The energetic exchange between harmonically resonating bodies creates the aesthetic standard of perfect beauty. This is the natural condition of space. As Manly Hall tells us, the motion of space is the perfect motion, the motion in which there is absolute harmony, absolute rhythm, and absolute beauty. Within the universe, we find expressed in both its space and time dimensions a perfect geometrical pattern, a pattern composed of numbers, sound, color, and form. This magnificent geometric procession is absolute beauty because it is absolute harmony. And because of the motion by which its parts are kept in eternal vibration, is completely ordered, it also imparts perfect rhythm. Manly Hall explains that, quote, there is nothing more beautiful than the working of the law. It is responsible for producing all the harmonic patterns of the visible world, which are themselves reflections of virtues residing in the invisible moral world. Creation naturally is beautiful because it innately moves according to law. Only mankind in its ignorance chooses to depart from law and create ugliness. The law itself flows as beauty and harmony in its own being, and when left unimpeded and undistorted by artificial values, every energy in space takes on a form of beauty. Therefore, the normal motions of energy in nature are beautiful. Wherever the pattern is normal, it is beautiful. Mankind, by contrast, has created an inconsistent sophistication or sophistry in which we have defined by artificial standards what constitutes nobility, symmetry, harmony, and rhythm. To fix this problem, we must reestablish our aesthetic values so that they align with the workings of law. The law specifies the gold standard of aesthetics. In a highly cultured civilization, nature's laws become the basis of society's internal laws, one specifying the design of art, technologies, governments, and societies. In this way, by matching the inner with the outer, or the lesser with the greater, human life comes into resonance with the divine. As Manly Hall summarizes, the universe does everything beautifully. Man, living beautifully, comes into harmony with life and moves with the rhythm of the world. By cultivating harmony and rhythm in himself, man becomes conscious of the universal motion, which the Taoists call the ever-flowing reality. And just as a side note, this is like the most perfect justification for like a philosophical approach to sustainability. So we become sustainable when we follow the law and live in accordance with the universal harmony, the world rhythm. That is sustainable. Anything outside of that is not sustainable. In conclusion, reflecting back on these 7 summary laws, Manly Hall writes that, quote, "The universe is a great seven-pointed star. Its points are its laws, its principles, and all living things abide with the vibrations of this great geometric pattern. The arts and sciences, the trades and the crafts, the professions, every part of learning, every mode of thought, every type of existence, all have their place in this great star-like pattern whose substance is God and whose body is law. In the realization of this, we find a philosophy that is applicable to our present time, one that will prove workable as the basis of a strength with which we can face this time intelligently. The law is working, and while the law works, all is right with the world." And that's the end of that last law there, harmony and rhythm. And this is also the end of the article. So I hope this was valuable and sort of like complementing our discussion in the previous episode and article on Manly Hall's Art of Discovery. I think it was. So this is really the philosophy of science that we're talking about in this article, and what the core ideas of science actually are, and how these need to be incorporated into our modern understanding of science in a way that they are not incorporated today. So that's our mission, or at least part of our mission. So overall, this article is called "The Seven Summary Laws of Nature," and we also went into fundamental concepts in the philosophy of science. So I hope this was interesting. Check back. The series on Francis Bacon will be continuing, and then we'll be moving forward towards the finale of the book here. So check back. Keep track with things. Once again, this is Alex Sacken. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you all soon. God bless.